but I'm just going to get us started. Just want to welcome everyone to the Governor Mills's monthly opioid response webinar. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day today to join us, whether it's your first time or you've been here many times. We really appreciate you being with us today. I am Madison Barassa. I am one of the SUD program managers here at the Office of Behavioral Health. Work closely with Gordon Smith, who is, of course, the director of opioid response. He sends his appreciation for everyone being here today and hopes to join us at the next series. Today's topic is really exciting, trafficking, exploitation, and substance use disorder treatment in rural Maine. Just wanted to take a minute to do some housekeeping things before we kick off. Not going to take too long, but we hope you all will join us on December 6th, which is our next webinar series from 11:30 to 12:30. As always, keep an eye out from AdCare for registration for that to learn more about the topic that we'll hear about in December. If you have any questions, please put those questions in the Q&A box today. The chat is not going to be monitored for questions. The chat is still open, but any questions that you have, please put those in the Q&A box so we can get through those this afternoon. If you don't get to any questions that you've posted in the chat, as always, AdCare will post those on their website in the upcoming weeks. If you would like, you can put your name, your organization, your location, and your role in the chat. Don't feel like you have to, but you're more than welcome to do so. All right, so we're really lucky to be joined today by a few wonderful folks. Jennifer Edwards is the Public Health Manager for the City of Auburn. Jennifer formerly served as the Program Director for the Not Here Justice in Action Network, a nonprofit organization raising awareness about human trafficking and exploitation in Maine. She continues to serve as a volunteer in the anti-trafficking space, and she'll be introducing our two primary presenters for today's webinar. Pass it over to you, gentlemen.
Thank you, Madison. So as Madison said, I'm Jennifer. Human trafficking and exploitation is a public health issue that impacts our state and our local communities, both urban and rural. It requires a public health approach, both in prevention and response. Those who look to exploit others take advantage of vulnerabilities that exist in our communities, vulnerabilities that we can all play a part in addressing as we work together to strengthen community safety nets. Human trafficking and exploitation also has public health consequences, which require an integrated and collaborative response that involves public safety, public health, and community-based organizations, which can meet the needs of victims of exploitation in a holistic way. This includes assisting impacted individuals and their families on healing journeys that sometimes include treatment and recovery from substance use disorders and co-occurring conditions. I'm happy to introduce you all to our two primary presenters today. Carey Nason is the Executive Director of St. Andre Home and its flagship program, CourageLIVES. Carey's career has included addressing the intersections of interpersonal and systemic violence, mental health, and substance use needs. Through her work with St. Andre Home, Carey has partnered with the Piscataquis County Sheriff, Helping Hands with Heart in Dover, and newly opened Recovery Wellness Center in Sangerville to respond to opioid use needs and related mental health and victimization needs within the Piscataquis region. Having a rural background and serving rural populations in her work, Carey sees the strengths and challenges of responding to the needs of rural communities and families impacted by human trafficking, exploitation, substance use disorder, and mental and behavioral health needs. She is a licensed alcohol and drug counselor, a licensed clinical social worker, and a certified clinical supervisor. Our next speaker, Ashley Johnson, is a program manager for Grace House for Women. Ashley's own career helping others began when she came to realize the gift of helping others while receiving support herself on her own recovery journey from substance use disorder, domestic abuse, and exploitation. Coming from a rural community, she would need to move 2 hours south to get the help she needed. Ashley now uses her own lived experiences to empower other women who have gone through similar challenges and has recently earned her ADCA and achieved certification as a peer recovery coach. As she now celebrates 21 months of sobriety, Ashley finds joy in giving others the chance to heal and live life more fully. Now I'll turn it over to Carey and Ashley for their presentation.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. I'm seeing all of the participants, and there's lots of folks I know, and I am excited to see folks from lots of rural areas. Thanks so much for joining us. Going to hop on to share screen. And just to confirm, this is visible, yes?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Just getting my screen situated so that I can see it. There we go. Oops. So Ashley, would you like to talk about your work at Grace House?
Absolutely. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. This topic is close to my heart. As Jennifer said, I don't only work in the community, but I'm also a survivor. Coming from a rural town, Canaan, Maine, I had to travel 2 hours to get help. And I landed at Grace House, and I'm lucky enough to be able to work there now. We work with women who have substance use disorder. Our main goal is to help get them out of the stress response. And something that I notice more and more is that as women start getting out of that stress response, the lack of resources, to help with these traumas that they've endured. And so I have partnered up with CourageLIVES to try to help close that gap. And I'm really excited to educate some of you guys, and hopefully, we can all work together and just help our community heal.
Thank you. And so our work of CourageLIVES is the flagship program of St. Andre Home. St. Andre Home will be celebrating its 85th anniversary in the spring, which is just absolutely wonderful to have that lengthy history. The work of St. Andre Home actually extends beyond 85 years ago. It goes back to the 1850s with the Good Shepherd Sisters in Quebec. And their work really began working with women who were on the streets and in the jails, and many whom at that time were identified as quote unquote prostitutes. And then fast forward from the 1850s to here we are now in 2024. And our work obviously has changed. That work has changed and it looks differently. But I just find this so incredible that that mission has stayed true to helping to meet the needs of women, children, and families in need. And so CourageLIVES, as the flagship program of St. Andre Home, is located in Bangor. And we provide services for anyone who has been impacted by human trafficking, exploitation, or other forms of abuse. We have a community center. We focus a whole lot on connection and leadership, helping to just really let folks know who have lived experience that they're wanted, that they're needed, that they have value, that they're important, helping to connect survivors with other survivors, helping to connect peers with other peers. We also provide case management, therapy for adults, lots of training, education. And we also have an on-site clothing closet called Courage Clothing. And we've started doing mobile Courage clothing too, which has been really phenomenal, starting off well. We have some clothing right now at PVHS in Milo. We have clothes that went out to Dexter High School yesterday. And so it's just great to be able to have opportunities that are low barrier, right, where folks can have their needs be met. We also have an on-site pantry called the Empowerment Pantry, where we're offering food, toiletries, baby items, pet items, and again, attempt to have that as low barrier as possible. We recently joined with Restoration Inc. The founders of Restoration Inc. have formally retired, and so they had approached us about taking on their work and services. And so we're now providing restorative tattoo care and support. We're hoping by the start of the year that we'll have our application out and ready to go to be able to take on new referrals for that program, which is exciting. And then we also provide showers and laundry services here at our Bangor location. And so before we launch into our presentation, we just want to really be sure that folks have access to good supports. This work is tough. And some of the things that we're going to be discussing, it might bring some things up for you. You might have further questions. You might have someone in your family who has been impacted by one of these needs. And so the work of the Maine Coalition Against Sexual Assault, there are 16 sexual assault centers across the state. You can reach any one of them 24 hours a day. They just provide some excellent advocacy services. The same thing for Maine Coalition to End Domestic Violence. They also have programs that cover all 16 counties within the state of Maine. They're available 24 hours a day. Wabanaki Women's Coalition, there are 5 programs through Wabanaki Women's Coalition. Through their website, it lists them all with their phone numbers. Also just a really incredible resource. And then also providing the National Human Trafficking Hotline, where people can make referrals, can get information, and can connect with resources across the country. And so our learning objectives, what we're hoping to do today, what we're planning to do, is really to define human trafficking and exploitation. We want to identify what these intersections are of human trafficking, exploitation, and substance use, as well as rural needs. Rural populations look a little bit differently than what urban and even suburban populations look like. So we really want to get into that. And then we also want to talk about the strengths, which there are many, as well as the challenges of rural service delivery and rural response and treatment. So, human trafficking, and feel free to jump in, Ashley, if there's anything with this that stands out to you. So human trafficking is essentially any type of work or labor that is performed through force, fraud, or coercion. This can be anything. Sometimes we think that human trafficking is only commercial sex trafficking, which is a form of human trafficking, but it goes beyond that. It also includes labor. It can also include things which we don't see a lot of here in Maine, things like organ trafficking or forced surrogacy. It can occur anywhere there's an opportunity to make a profit on someone, and it can occur in any industry or any business. Federally, anyone who is under the age of 18 who is engaging in quote unquote sex work is considered a victim. So there's no such thing as child prostitution within the US anyway, as far as how the US defines this. Human trafficking is often difficult to leave. It is not as easy as, oh, I'm just going to pick up and walk out the door. It can be very dangerous to leave. There are many reasons why folks get stuck and get caught up in what's going on. Human trafficking, it's illegal federally. It's also illegal here within Maine, and that there's some Maine laws that relate to trafficking. So there's a change recently with Maine law that it's illegal to purchase sexual acts, but not to provide them or to make them available. There's also an affirmative defense law where if someone has been trafficked, that they've been caught up in a crime related to that trafficking, because lots of times traffickers make their victims basically do their dirty work. And so there's an affirmative defense clause that victims can utilize. Now, I recognize that this is a very quick overview. But we just wanted to provide a little bit of context for what trafficking is. And then anything you wanted to add, Ashley, to that?
Yeah, I think a good point to make also is in rural Maine, more often than not, your trafficker or exploiter is, part of your family, or a loved one, a spouse. So there becomes this, extra component to that. You don't want to go against your family. You don't want to go against your spouse. And there's a lot of manipulation, in that. So I think that that's something important to bring up.
Thank you. So exploitation, we see a lot of exploitation in our work. We see things that do rise to the level of human trafficking to meet that federal definition. And then we also see a lot of things that don't meet that level, but are exploitive. One of the big pieces with exploitation is that it's not often illegal. It's abusive. It's definitely a utilization of power and control against someone, but it doesn't meet that legal definition of a crime, which makes it challenging. And so exploitation is essentially a situation where someone who has a need is taken advantage of by another or others for their own gain. It is definitely on that continuum of abuse and violence, and we do see people being harmed through exploitation. And so the some examples of that would be performing a sexual act to obtain transportation or some other type of need. Someone may be providing cleaning and childcare and just taking care of a home kind of beyond what the market rate price or what they would be receiving if they were being paid for that service, just in exchange for a place to sleep. Or a dealer, a drug dealer who is charging someone higher prices because they know that that person's in active withdrawal. And so they know that that person is stuck and needs that substance in order to feel better and in order to function. And so we'll charge a greater price. Anything that you would like to add to that, Ashley?
I think that, a cycle happens here with exploitation a lot. Where the victim almost protects or sticks up for the person that is exploiting them because they do have something that they need, in order to survive, whether it be a place that they live, rides for their children, just in order not to have violence happen. And, this manipulation goes really deep in this mental abuse, I would call it, or emotional, where that victim then starts standing up for that exploiter because they have provided them what it is that they need.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and we use the word option to leave option in quotations because that's a great example of folks getting stuck and not always being able to, quote unquote, leave that situation because they're trying to get their needs be met. And so we're going to talk about what's rural. Rural is one of my most favorite things to talk about. And so rural, to define it, is surprising because there's lots of information about what it isn't. And then finding a concrete example, because there are different places that define rural differently. And so utilizing a census perspective is that any area and the areas surrounding a population of 50,000 people or more, that's considered urban, right? That's not rural, but that's essentially the definition of rural, if that makes sense. So it would be the areas outside of that. And about 20% of the US population lives in rural areas. That's 1 in 5. And it's characterized as sparsely populated, has a low housing density, being far from an urban center. I find this next statistic just really incredible, that urban areas comprise 3% of US landmass, but only 80%, but 80% of the population lives there. So there's a lot of people who are living in urban or suburban areas, which means that 97% of US landmass is considered rural. And so Maine is known as the most rural state in the US due to 50% of its land being uninhabited, which when I was, a while ago pulling this together, I didn't realize myself that it was that much, that half of Maine is considered, quote unquote, uninhabited. And so that equals 11.3 million acres that are considered uninhabited. And so there's 5 urban centers and 24 urban clusters and 3 urban cities within Maine. And so Portland, Lewiston, and Bangor are those 3 main urban cities. And then everything else outside of that, again, is considered rural. Maine is also the oldest state in the country, with over 60% of those who live in rural Maine, being older adults. I don't think I quite said that clearly, but there's a lot of older adults who live in rural regions. And then how that interconnects with substance use is that it's actually been found that there's higher rates of substance use needs among older rural Maine adults who have prescriptions for controlled substances. And so what that means is that there are folks who have, prescriptions for pain management, folks who might have long-term prescriptions for benzodiazepines or other types of medications. And this is a population that can easily be overlooked when it comes to substance use needs and substance use treatment. And so the appeal of rural, before COVID, there was this, I think, an overall negative view of rural living. You know, there was a lot of work that had come out about the drain on resources, how rural towns, rural villages, unincorporated areas, right? That's a drain on a resource because it's far from where all of the services are. That there was this view that, rural regions were quote unquote behind the times. And then COVID brought about some big changes around that. There's a lot of people who came to Maine, a lot of people who settled in rural areas in Maine. And all of our counties, other than Aroostook County, saw a population influx during COVID, and extends beyond that, right? Rural is home. Rural is home to lots of people in Maine. Rural has a type of beauty that isn't found in other areas. Rural has a lot of community and a lot of connection. There's a strong sense of independence, and some of that comes by nature of being rural. With a reduced amount of resources, it means that when things need to be done, things need to be done. And so folks take care of that. Communities take care of the things that need to be done. There's a sense of peace and calm, along with the reality that there's less crime, right? Rural areas tend to have less violent crime. And then the quintessential, I use that in quotes, there's an appeal, right? There's this appeal of what is quote unquote quintessential Maine. And I don't know what's more quintessential Maine than rural regions. And then we pose this question of why not rural? I mean, I look at rural areas and I think, why not? Why would we not want to be there? Anything you wanted to add with appeal to rural, Ashley?
No, I think you did wonderful.
Well, thank you. And then we're going to look at the flip side of that, is that there's some big challenges of rural life that definitely have an impact around, human trafficking, exploitation, as well as, the ability for folks to access support around substance use needs. Transportation is a big one. In order to get from point A to point B in a rural area, it means having a vehicle or being able to access a ride or some means of transportation is essential. We had talked about rural areas being sparsely populated, which means, right, there's a further distance from point A to point B. Or if someone has to travel to more of a population hub to access care or services, or they want to travel, it means they have to cover a greater distance. We have seen transportation definitely be a major need for folks who are experiencing trafficking or exploitation, because for someone to be able to get out of that situation or to be able to leave, transportation is essential. And then figuring out that process, how do I access transportation safely? We served a family one time in rural Maine where the next closest neighbor was a mile away. And for someone to just quote unquote leave, right? How do you do that? How do you organize your life in order to be able to do that? Housing, homelessness and being unhoused in rural Maine is often unseen and invisible. Lots of times, we don't quote unquote see folks who are homeless congregating on a street in rural Maine. It looks differently. It can be that there is a camper, so to speak, that is in the woods, and there are people who kind of rotate in and out of staying in that camper. We see folks who kind of move from place to place, or sleep outside, and sometimes they can be overlooked. Rural life tends to have higher high school graduation rates, which sometimes can be surprising, right? For folks to think about that. Higher graduation rates than urban students, but have a lower post-secondary attendance. And so what that means is that it contributes to more limited employment options and a lower pay scale. And that definitely comes into play when we're looking at trafficking and exploitation, because where do people have access to the things that they need? Where do they have access to income? We also see in rural life a greater acceptance of substance use, particularly around alcohol and marijuana. There are some locations within Maine now where there's really no grocery store, but you can go purchase marijuana. And so what does that mean if someone's not able to immediately address their basic needs, but they can have access to substances? There tend to be also higher rates of methamphetamine use within rural areas. Rural life means that there can be greater health needs and greater challenges with accessing health needs. Reduced populations in rural areas mean overall, right, like reduced revenues, reduced taxes. There aren't as many folks who are paying taxes to support the infrastructure, to provide services, which again contributes to some of the challenges or difficulties of accessing services. And then forced migration. Sometimes we think of forced migration as, oh, well, that's an international need. That happens in another place. And yes, absolutely. So for instance, there are folks coming into Maine through resettlement or through migration, immigration. And folks who had to leave their areas, leave their homes for a variety of reasons. Well, we've also seen forced migration within Maine. So I think of the mill closures and what has that meant for folks who had worked at the mills or their livelihoods were based on that. And then with the loss of industry have had to move. Thinking about farming when there has been bankruptcy with farming. Or really any type of business, right? It has meant that people have had to move in order to be able to live. And so that creates a risk. Anything that you wanted to add here, Ashley?
I love all the points that you touched on, and it just adds such a extra challenge to getting out of a dangerous lifestyle or getting help for substance use disorder. My own story, I had to move 2 hours away from anything that I knew. It took 3 people to get me here. And just to make that choice to try to get help and live a different life is scary in itself. But I had never seen anything about recovery. I had no idea what it was. And so that's a big leap of faith that you have to take, and I would love to see more education around exploitation, substance use, and things like that, in northern and western Maine. I think that it would make that choice a little more accessible.
Mm-hmm. And so how does trafficking happen? Do you want to do this one, Ash?
Oh, no, you're doing great.
Okay, I will continue along. And so we get asked this question, how does this happen, right? Human trafficking here in Maine, what does that look like? And so essentially, traffickers prey upon both real and perceived vulnerabilities and break down the systems. And so when people's basic needs aren't met, things like food, like housing, like safety, this increases their risk factors. And for someone who has substance dependency, that risk factor is even more heightened because when the substance becomes the primary need, right? Like I need a substance in order to not be sick. I need a substance in order to be able to function. And I don't have readily available access to that substance. Traffickers will prey upon that. And so the majority of victims know their traffickers. And Ashley, you had talked about this a little bit earlier. We see lots of folks where their first trafficking experience in Maine is through their family, friends, neighbors, a romantic partner through a relationship. Since COVID, we've seen more and more folks connect and meet people online. And there's also organized operations here in Maine. I know there have been some recent news pieces that are speaking to that, where there's organized groups that are selling within Maine and just I think really wreaking some havoc in some communities.
Yeah, and I wanted to just touch base as well. You know, sometimes this looks like being up north with nowhere to go. It's cold, it's snowing, and some nice person says, "Hey, you know, you shouldn't be out here. It's cold. You can stay at my house." You get driven, 40 minutes to nowhere. And then you get there with the expectation to perform. And you're left with this choice, do I do what this person wants and get to stay warm, or do I leave and I don't know even where I am, really? No cell phone service, no vehicle, and things like that. And when, more often than not, that I have seen, when people experience their first trafficking or exploitation in that manner, there's such a sense of shame and guilt, and it's my fault. And, because there's not necessarily this big argument that, no, I'm not going to do this. You're left in a moment with a choice, for a basic need. Am I going to freeze trying to walk home, or am I going to do this? And so, that just really kind of adds another level to it.
I think what you're saying speaks to this slide very well. Would you like to talk about this one?
So I can't read the slide. I'm so sorry.
Oh, it's okay. I will go with it. It's so some of what, with Ashley and I, with our work, we see so much of a grooming process. Yeah. And that grooming process can be within a family, that this is generational. This is what is expected. This is what goes on. When it comes to things like labor trafficking, we also see grooming here as well. Like, oh, you're looking for a job? Oh, great. I have a job to offer you. And it's going to be great, right? Talks the person up, makes lots of promises, a lure of something better. But then there's a bait and switch. Actually, that's not what you're going to be doing. You're going to be doing this. And there really isn't a quick and easy way out. And lots of times the public really focuses on the danger and risks of strangers. Maine, especially in rural Maine, right? We're afraid of quote unquote from away. Like, what do things from away look like that are that are coming in? And lots of times there's a greater risk of who and what is immediately around us.
Definitely. I know being a drug mule is part of this. And you have a boyfriend, and you guys are going on a run together, and you get to the 2 states down, over, and you're expected to hold on to the stuff whatever way that is. It's demeaning, and all of these things, but you have no choice. And all of a sudden, you were going on a trip with your boyfriend, and you're coming back like that. And then it's very much, well, if you loved me, you would do this, why don't you care about me, and stuff like that. So the manipulation is just so high.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and what a great cover, right? You went on a trip with your boyfriend.
Yeah.
Because who's going to think anything of that? Oh, that's just a regular old normal thing to do. And lots of times people don't recognize that or see that, like that there's actually trafficking there, or there's exploitation there.
Yeah.
So we also took a look at ACEs scores, and rural youth are more likely to have higher ACEs scores than urban youth in the areas of economic hardship, substance use, mental health, neighborhood violence, right? Which can be really surprising, because sometimes we have this image of that, oh, well, cities are dangerous and that there's more violence and abuse that happens there. Rural kids are actually exposed to higher levels of neighborhood violence within their homes, within their families. There's greater levels of incarceration, parental death, and parental separation and divorce. And then the impact that we see of this on rural families is generational trauma. And generational trauma is compound and complex. And so when we're working with folks and supporting folks who have experienced this, they coming from a rural area, having a higher ACEs score, particularly where we also see trafficking be a generational thing as well. Right? There's a lot to kind of unpack there. There's a lot of support that is needed, not only for that person who might be being trafficked or exploited, but also the folks around them, because the likelihood that that person's family and that their immediate kind of group is also being trafficked or has experienced exploitation, it's greater. There's a higher level of kinship care within rural families, grandparents and even great-grandparents raising kids. Rural counties in Maine have high rates of children in foster care compared to more populated counties. The last numbers I saw were for August. I don't know if September's out, but it was right around 300 kids or so were in care for Penobscot County. What was it? I know someone on here will be able to speak to that. Aroostook County had a higher level, Somerset, Piscataquis, and then, in looking at the rates of kids in foster care for, Southern Maine, it's like, oh my goodness, per capita, that there's more kids coming from those rural areas. And then youth who are aging out of foster care have greater risk around trafficking, around being targeted by traffickers and abusers for trafficking. We're just very mindful of that. Anything else you wanted to add here, Ashley?
No, that was good.
Okay. And so education, as we take a holistic kind of broad-based approach, we also look at the role of education. And education has a strong piece of this work of addressing trafficking. Even though, right, sometimes we don't think of that, of school being that place, but school is that place for lots of rural youth that they go to, where they receive support, where they receive a meal, where they have access to the things that they need. And education has consistently been shown as a top factor in helping individuals and families to address their needs related to poverty consistently. What's happening right now is that rural schools are lacking teachers, right? There's a lack of teachers right now across the board, but it impacts rural schools even more because, right, if you have positions that are open, it means that there's greater pressure on, other faculty and staff to take care of the needs overall, right? Like, it's a ripple effect. There's also a lack of bus drivers and school counselors. And so in preparation for this, we consulted with Katie Flood. She is the director of enrollment for Let's Get Ready, which is a national program that focuses on access to college. And she's also a doctoral student at the University of Maine, doing work looking at rural education and the needs of youth coming from rural regions. And so what she had said, that one of the big pieces that school provides is exposure. And it's not only exposures to within a community, but it's also exposure to things outside of a community. And that the shortage of staff, it's dampening ability for students to be able to imagine what their full potential is. As we look at trafficking means that someone really oftentimes gets stuck in a place of thinking and believing that this is what my life is going to be. And traffickers reinforce that message. You are mine. You don't have other options. You do what I say that you do. And we're not saying that education fixes that. We're not saying that education, is the almighty answer to stop trafficking. We just recognize that education has a really big role and a really big place around this. What would you like to add to this, Ashley?
I just really love that point. When people feel like they have no other option, they're, trying to leave isn't even something that crosses their mind. I think education is so important. And I would love for more people to hear about, what is trafficking and what is exploitation. I think that, a lot of women that I work with don't even realize that they're in that category because of the manipulation that has happened. So reaching out for help wouldn't even be something that they would know to do. So yeah, I think education is huge.
Some potential indicators of trafficking. If you're working with someone or you see that someone has no money or lots of money, and the lots of money piece would be directly following the no money piece, where did that money come from? If you're working with folks who have a substance use need and you're hearing them mention or talk about drug debts, because drugs are expensive, using is expensive, and how is it that someone is paying for what they're using? If you see someone who has connections with new people, and not just, oh, hey, I made a new friend, but like new people that don't quite fit with whatever, where did they come from? How did that connection happen? And especially if you see someone's behavior change, that they're looking differently, they're dressing differently, that there's just a lot of changes. If you see someone whose needs are clearly not being met, it's an indicator. It doesn't mean, oh, yes, that's trafficking. It means these are indicators, things for us to tune into and pay attention to and to follow up on. Delays in care, lack of treatment. This one, coming from a farming family, this was the norm. You did not go get medical care because, right, there were other things to take care of and to do, especially, I think of my grandparents and farm life. Those are just aches and pains. Like you still have work that needs to be done, but really looking at someone who needs to go access care and they're not for reasons that don't quite match up or don't make sense. The same thing if someone tells you a story, and I don't use the story that they're lying or fabricating it. It just means that there's stuff that doesn't match. If someone has a scripted response, if they've moved recently, a frequent relocation, if they don't have their documents, if they don't have their identification, these can be indicators that something's going on.
Inability to make eye contact too is a big one.
Yeah, sometimes eye contact can mean that like something's going on. Sometimes eye contact can also be a cultural piece too. And so just further explore that, like that change. If someone doesn't seem comfortable for any number of reasons. If there's someone who seems to be running the show for that person, who answers for them, speaks for that person, someone who's always there. If English is not someone's primary language, and they provide their own translator, what's going on with that? If someone doesn't know answers to basic questions, that always tips me off of there's more to this. Someone who has tattoos, brands, marks, or scars, lots of folks have tattoos, lots of folks have scars, but really, when you have a relationship with someone, kind of inquiring, about those, what do those things mean? Injuries, recurrent sexually transmitted infections, someone who has had multiple or frequent pregnancies, frequent or forced abortions, someone who kind of disappears. Like where did you go? Someone who was on the radar screen and then they're kind of not there for a period of time. Other things you wanted to add to that, Ashley?
No, I think that was great.
Okay, so this next slide is examples of trafficking in rural Maine. And so as we were, preparing for this, we talked through what are some of those common things that we have seen. We have seen many situations where someone has a housing cost or a housing need. And we've seen landlords take advantage of someone for that. Things like, oh, well, here's what you can do for me and your rent will be covered. And these aren't things that someone really wants to do. Ashley, you had mentioned, drug dealing and muling. We've also seen running weapons, because if I'm just making up a name here. Well, I'll just use my name. So if I'm Carey and let's say I'm coming from, Fort Kent, and I happen to get picked up with a weapon in my vehicle, that looks really differently than, let's say, someone else getting picked up with weapons in their vehicle. I'm just carrying, I have this gun and no, it's not registered to me, right? Like, oops. the likelihood that I'm able to have that fly under the radar is greater. Webcamming, we've seen lots and lots of online exploitation and lots of online trafficking, where that's the primary, that's been the primary thing that someone has had to do. We've worked with folks who are trafficked through like bachelor parties or going to deer camp, right? Like we're in the middle of hunting season. And we have worked with folks where that's what they did. That's what they were forced to do. They were sent from camp to camp to camp in the Maine woods. And I don't believe necessarily that the hunters knew what was going on. I think that they thought that this was, a legitimate service that they found online and signed up for and kind of ordered who they wanted to come to deer camp. But then who was being, kind of run through that person wasn't doing that of their own accord. Farm labor, Maine is a large agricultural state. And so we've seen situations where folks have been exploited and trafficked through their labor. Generational, which we talked about, we mentioned, generational sexual exploitation and sex trafficking. We have worked with families before where we find out that it's the great grandmother, the grandmother, the daughter, and then the granddaughter. So it's like 4 generations have been trafficked all within the same family. And we also suspect, right, that even goes beyond those 4 generations. And then we use the term that house. We all know, right? Like, quote unquote, that house. So many things happen at that house. We have worked with so many people where, that house over there down the road, what goes on there. And there's lots of things that go on, quote unquote, at that house. It's the place that everyone knows that things are happening, but it doesn't get called trafficking. It just gets referenced as that house. It's like, oh, well, that's like a drag of society. We just ignore that house, that place, even though there's sex trafficking that's going on, even though there is drug dealing going on, even though there's drug running and muling, even though, right, that there's scamming and right, we say, oh, that house. Things you want to add, Ashley?
I think you covered it beautifully. I do want to just touch base on like that house. Something really sad happens because the women like going in and out of there a lot of times in the experience that I've heard, they're the people that are judged, right? Not necessarily the trafficker. It's look at those girls, they were down to so-and-so's house last week and this or that. And that stigma, that shame and that judgment really keeps a lot of people stuck. And it's, I just would love to be part of helping that go away.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I am mindful of time and we're at 20 past, so I'm going to fly really fast. We'll go through these slides really quickly so that there's a few minutes left over for questions. Lots of benefits of rural services, relationships. So much gets done in rural communities through relationship. There can be tremendous community support, creative responses. And if you need to hide out in a safe way, sometimes rural communities, that's where it's at. Oh my goodness. And then the flip side to that, right? There's some challenges. Ashley, you were just speaking to this about stigma, the community judgment, the sense that everybody knows what's going on. The flip side to the safety of easy to hide is that in rural areas, it can also be easier to hide illegal activities. Struggles with childcare. There can be closed systems and distrust of outside providers at times. Animal care. This is something that we have run into, that when someone is needing to access treatment, where do they send their animals? Virtual services. Sometimes the answer to rural service needs, we'll just do telehealth for everything. Everything can be virtual. Well, that's not always a great answer, especially if someone is facing abuse or violence where they are. There can be a lack of privacy. There can also be a lack of access. Sometimes folks don't have laptops. Sometimes They have a phone that is dead, that is out of minutes, and there's no way to access, telehealth. The same thing if there isn't electricity because the lights have been turned off. Assessment questions. Here's just some really basic assessment questions, looking at work, looking at income, housing, substance use, and supports. I'm going to just kind of quickly jump over that. And then looking at rural response and treatment, focusing on the relationship and keep showing up. That has been such a big piece of our work, that we keep showing up. We show up when times are good, and we show up for folks when times aren't so good, and everywhere in between. And it's really important within rural communities that we respect privacy and really assess and promote safety, because rural communities are small, information can travel quickly, and we want to support someone's confidentiality. We want to support and promote their safety. Sometimes we get afraid to have the conversation around what we're seeing and what we're concerned about. And really, I think an easy way to say that is I've noticed, hey, Ashley, I noticed you haven't been yourself lately, right? That starts the conversation, and we can talk about things. And then refer and help folks connect with resources. Just a few other pieces with this, taking a look at childcare needs, community meals. Rural communities, I think, do a tremendous job of having the church supper or have it, right, the community meal, and take a look at, are there free rides that are offered to get someone there? Can the meal be free? Is there clothing that's available? Some examples that I think have done a great job with that. Skowhegan, in Skowhegan, there previously used to be the Fridge that was downtown. Anyone could go to the fridge and grab foods, which was great. And then summer meal distributions in the summer that lots of rural schools have done. Another piece with rural responses is give some thought to where your information hubs are. Information hubs in rural communities look differently. Your gas station and your corner store may be the best place to get information out to your community. Telehealth, the flip side to telehealth, sometimes not so good, not so safe, but then other times it is. Telehealth has been shown to increase participation for LGBTQ+ rural youth. Telehealth, there's a lot of work that's being done around MAT treatment through telehealth, and to be able to participate in groups, which can be just incredible. I'm going to skip through this. I'm going to speak very quickly about our Reaching Rural initiative. I love this partnership. I am excited for what is coming together. So this is through Piscataquis County Sheriff's Recovery Wellness Center in Sangerville, which just opened. If you haven't been there yet, make a plan. It's worth it to drive to Sangerville and go see what the work that they're doing. It's very cool. Working with Helping Hands with Heart, which I believe is one of the oldest, if not the oldest, community response group in the country. I don't know, I might be stating that wrong. If it's not, it's up there. It is up there. And then our work, and really the goals of this partnership, are to promote information and education about resources, provide reentry support for affected individuals and family members, and to provide training on intersections of these things: opioid use disorder, substance use needs, mental health needs, as well as human trafficking, exploitation, and abuse. And then resources, Maine Children's Alliance, Maine Rural Health Research Center, Maine Shared Community Health Needs Assessment. I love the Maine Shared Community Health Needs Assessment, gives lots of great information. And NADAC, Wabanaki Women's Coalition, I mentioned these earlier, Maine Coalition Against Sexual Assault, Maine STEN, MCTV, Survivor Street. Preble Street provides case management services for folks who have experienced trafficking. Great resource. Child advocacy centers. There are lots of anti-trafficking coalitions across the state. They're always open and welcoming for folks to join and participate. ILAP, Mass Gen, St. Joe's. I'm going to give a shout out to St. Joe's Safe Program, located in Bangor. They're serving people in some really great creative ways. And then I'm also including in here, although not, again, a rural resource, but Faith Linking in Action. They're doing some really cool work looking at food, housing, and transportation needs, and connecting services, communities with faith communities through that. And then the Polaris Project, a national human trafficking hotline. You can call that, you can access that 24 hours a day and get access to support and resources. And so with that, I know we went really quick at the end, and I think we have just a few minutes for some questions.
So there are some questions that people have sent in. The first one is there a tip line for reporting a potential bat house that may exist? And can you remain anonymous if you make that phone call?
So the National Human Trafficking Hotline can be an option and a resource for that, because you can provide tips. You can, with 800 numbers, your number when you call does show up, even when we try to block it out. But you don't have to give a name. You don't have to say who you are. You can call from a different number to do that. Some law enforcement agencies do have anonymous tip lines. It depends on where you are and your municipality. Sometimes law enforcement response is great. Other times it can just get complicated for a variety of reasons, especially if, if someone is being trafficked through, quote unquote, that house. Sometimes the safety level, it can be just really challenging. Great questions. I know we all know that house, don't we? Mm-hmm.
The next question that came in through the chat is, given a history of trauma and how few services are available in rural areas, what kinds of things would make you and or those you work with feel better about returning to living or working in rural parts of Maine in the future? And what are some things to consider when we are preparing people to go back to their rural communities?
Oh, I love that question. Ashley, I think this is all you.
So for myself, I went down and I had one of the first amends that I made was to the Skowhegan Police Department. And I said, can you please, give my number out? And this is the person that I called. I had called Access Direct Recovery, and they put me in touch with Grace House. And so they kept all those phone numbers and stuff. And, I've gotten a few phone calls from them. And then I would love to go back and bring, recovery and things like that to any small town. That's why I'm doing something like this. I go for National Overdose Awareness Day, anything that I can do.
Yeah. The next question is about reaching adolescents who have been trafficked and if they need SUD services. Can you talk about that a little, please?
You want to do that one, Ashley?
You can get that one.
Okay. So, right. It's a tough one. Relationship, and don't give up on them. I know that sounds, like a quick kind of passive answer, but continuing to hang in there with them, continuing to show up for them. Sometimes adolescents don't jump into treatment.
It takes a while to feel safe. And then even when you do feel safe again, sometimes you think this is too good to be true. So it definitely, it could be years, of just consistent, you are worth it, it's okay to have big feelings, things like that.
Happy to talk with you more specifically if you have something that you're working on. I think we're at time.
We are. I'm so sorry. I wish we had so much more time to continue on this conversation. It's really rich. Thank you both so much for joining us today, providing having this space for all of us to learn. thank you to Jen as well for joining us. For folks who joined us today, of course, thank you for continuing to hop on these calls. I know that this topic can be a little heavy and sometimes could be triggering for some folks. So as Carey and Ashley had stated, please take some time for yourselves, reach out to your support network or reach out to some of the resources that they provided today. If you need support connecting to those resources, you can reach out to Lorena or to myself and we can absolutely get you connected. So with that said, thank you to AdCare also and Lorena for hosting us today, and we will see you all in December. Thank you so much. Take care, everyone.
Thank you so
Thank you,
much.
everyone.
Bye.